please. What is big data? The definition, if you ask anyone, is going to be a bit of a moving target depending on their perspective. But very generally, big data refers to a collection of data sets that are so large and complex that it's impossible to process them with the usual databases and tools. Some of the characteristics include that it's difficult to capture, very difficult to store, difficult to search, to share, or to analyze and visualize. Even NIST is actually weighing in with their own version or their own definition of this in the sense that NIST looks at big data as any data which exceeds the capacity or capability of current or conventional methods and systems. So in other words, NIST is looking at this with the notion that big is really relative to the standard of computation or computing power that we have on hand at the moment. So I know this all seems a bit abstract still, so I want to put it into some context. And actually I want to throw it to John, who's joining us, just to provide a brief overview of big data applications in both the public and the private sectors. If you can give us some practical perspective on how is this actually being applied in real life.
Thanks very much for that, Tim. I hope everybody can hear me. If I need to get closer to the microphone, wave your arms in the back or wherever. And just to give a little perspective, I thought Tim's introductory trivia slides were useful, and to give you some context, a yottabyte is actually equals the number of cat videos that are uploaded to the YouTube site once a week. So it's a large number. That was my attempt at some opening humor, so you can see that I'll just stay away from the jokes and get right to the presentation. In terms of just adding a little bit more color to a definition of big data, I think if you were to ask 100 different experts, they'd give you 100 different answers. But it's useful to go back and look at the White House report that came out last month as kind of a touchstone as far as what the collective, at least what the administration is thinking about in terms of big data. That report was entitled Big Data Seizing Opportunities and Preserving Values, and they just described it really as the 3 V's: volume, variety, and velocity. The sources of big data are also about as wide a spectrum as you could imagine, but it's public records, social media, health records, financial data, transactional data, sensor data, and of course the Internet of Things, which is going to really explode in terms of the amount of data that can be collected and transmitted. And the last kind of opening note I would say is big data alone really doesn't mean anything in and of itself. I think when you think of big data, you also have to think of a verb that goes with it, and that verb is analytics. You're doing analytics with big data and how it's actually managed and processed, and that's what we'll be including in our shorthand version when we say big data. So Tim asked for a few examples in terms of what is happening with big data, both in government and private sector. There are tremendous benefits for your business, and there are tremendous benefits for the public with big data. Some quick examples of government uses: they have a program called Blue Button, which is actually allows veterans through the VA to an easy way to access their veteran health records. The IRS also has something called Get Transcripts, which allows taxpayers to easily access their tax records going back several years. There are other applications that go to student records as well. So the government is definitely heavily invested in looking at the uses and benefits of big data. Some examples in the private sector, I'll give you 3 quick ones. Intel uses big data and analytics to do network security, to look at what's the safe traffic that is out there on the internet, what's the high-risk traffic, how can they predict trends in demand, where can they identify threats. In the health area, Merck uses patient data to help mitigate against patient readmission rates, to try to reduce those. They look at specific factors in doing their analytics to try to bring down those readmission rates. Last quick example I'll mention is IBM. was involved in a project with certain counties in the state of Alabama to reduce student dropout rates in high schools. And they did an analysis of student test scores and attendance and found ways to target and reduce student dropouts. So those are really some quick examples to kind of give you a little bit more meat to the big data world, and I'm happy to let anybody else on the panel chip in here if they want, or we'll turn it back to Tim.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just a couple of comments on that. From a carrier perspective, one of the areas that we really focus on, and the insurance industry is kind of is focused on, and you're certainly going to speak to this a lot, but is the behavioral advertising piece that's involved in big data, and just looking at some of the early adopters of that. One of them was Amazon. And I sort of forgot that Amazon used to be in the business of selling books, and that was sort of their thing. You'd go online and you'd buy a book, and there would be a column that would have a book review kind of next to your purchase. And they were looking at small sets of data. So it was, this is from a book. I don't know if it's Big Data or The Naked Truth, but one of the two kind of pointed this out. It was, you'd look at the small subset of data, and you'd say, okay, if you buy a book on, ballet, maybe then the next book that might be recommended would be some variation of that. So another book on ballet or another kind of dance or some sort of arts. And then they started doing this thing called item-to-item collaborative filtering. And that was one of the earlier movements in big data. And what they would do is they'd say, okay, let's look at, just take some results, just look at the information served on a very pure basis and say, people who like to buy books on ballet also like to buy, Band-Aids, right? And so as Amazon started to expand their business and started to sell other things other than just books, this became very valuable for them. And they sort of reached a tipping point where they said, are we going to put on the reviews on the side of the book reviews? Is that where what's really going to drive sales and drive people to buy additional items or additional books? Or should we just go with sort of you might like a X item? And what they found was overwhelmingly that the big data, that they sort of shifted over to we're going to use big data. And that item-to-item filtering really helped to boost their sales. Amazon now, they say a third of all the sales are said to result from recommendations and, that personalization aspect. So, when we look at, a lot of insurance companies are looking at big data, this is one of the focal points. It's, how do you use data to boost sales? And when you start to involve a personal aspect and looking at individuals or groups of people, you get into issues with, potential discrimination, or you get into an area where a lot of people are uncomfortable, where they don't want you to know that much about them. So, we'll talk about this a little bit more later in the panel, but just from our perspective, that would be an example of big data that we'd be pretty focused on.
Thanks, guys. And Lynn, I think you had some additional examples in the behavioral advertising context of just some of the general practices and trends that you're seeing from companies now.
Okay, so I'm going to give you my big data story. I've been doing privacy law for 12 years, and I'm kind of really intense about my privacy because I've seen all the bad stuff that can happen. So I got a new iPhone, and I went into the mall, and I went to the Apple store to get a car charger because I'm always in my car, and those things never last, right? Those batteries were always charging. So I go in and I say, I just want a regular, no bells and whistles charger, plug in, it charges. Here you go, $24.95. I hand the guy $30, and he goes, "What's your name?" And I go, "What's yours?" And he goes, "Well, I need your name to be able to open the cash register." And I was like, "Well, I'm not giving you my name. That's why I use cash. Put someone else's name in because I'm not." So that's how crazy the big data collection is, that Apple not only knows if I have my location-based services on where I am at all times and I'm walking past a restaurant and they go, "Oh, Lynn, really good restaurant you're walking next to." But, you know, you use your CVS card and they know everything that you're buying, and you're going to tell about the Target case, which is quite interesting. You might tell it now. It's so interesting.
Well, this is actually public knowledge. You guys can look it up on the news. But, you know, more recently, Target used its analytics, right, to determine that based on the purchases that you were making in their store, you were potentially pregnant. And they sent ads and advertisements to that consumer, not knowing that the consumer was actually younger than 18 and hadn't told the parents yet. So analytics, while very helpful in sometimes predicting things, can also run you into a bit of trouble.
So there's every time you have one of those rewards cards, you know, they're tracking everything that you're doing for a purpose because they want to market to you. So one of the things that's very interesting is, as usual, the law has not caught up to technology. And there are lots of laws, which I'll talk about in a bit, that apply to the collection and use of data. But pretty much it all comes down to these companies are allowed to utilize this data and allowed to collect it if they are transparent about it in their privacy policy. So how many people have a Gmail account? Okay, how many people read the terms and conditions of use and privacy policy? Yeah, okay, 2 of us, right? Basically, the unfortunate thing is every time you look on a privacy policy or terms of conditions of use, it's basically saying we can use your information and we can sell it, we can slice it, we can dice it, we can, if you're giving it to us and we're providing a service to you, we can do that. So there's a lot of use of data that people are giving, and they're using it in a legal way. There's lots of laws that apply, but basically, if they're transparent and you're agreeing to it, they're allowed to use it for behavioral advertising. And then we'll talk about where the hiccups happen in a little bit.
Yeah, and just so one other point to that. So some of the information that's collected too, it might not draw a normal correlation that like we would draw.
Yeah.
One of the correlations that's been determined is that if you buy anti-scratch pads for your furniture, so you know those little things that go on the bottom of your furniture so your floors don't get scratched up, you have a very high likelihood of paying your bills. That is used, so when you buy a little scratch pad, because of big data, that's used by credit card companies. So hopefully everyone go out here and, you know, mess up the metrics, but I think the point is that it's not things that you would normally draw a correlation between, but because we have these very large sets of information, we're able to do that. It doesn't make a difference. We're not looking at, you know, what's the underlying reason. We're just looking at that basic correlation of information.
Yeah, and the correlations actually go both ways, we need to remember, right? They might say that if you buy anti-scratch pads, then you're more likely to pay your bills on time, but also the inverse, that maybe if you're at a 7-Eleven late at night at 3 a.m. making purchases, then maybe you're less likely to pay your bills, and therefore maybe you won't get as high of a credit on the next application you do for credit. So those are the kind of things that everybody here needs to be thinking about in terms of the big data and the analytics behind big data.
And maybe just to build on what Andrea has said, and going back to the title of our panel, which is Big Data and Wrongful Collection, I think when we're talking about the point of collection for data, in the big data world, the real challenge is going to be to the traditional privacy principles that I'm sure everybody is familiar with in the room, the Fair Information Practice principles. And specifically, it will be a challenge in the areas of consent, because big data is really stepping away from that one-on-one relationship that you have. And the other area where it's going to be a challenge for the FIPS is in use limitation or purpose limitation, because big data doesn't really know those boundaries so well. So organizations are going to really be challenged to ensure that data is used and managed properly, and looking at the consent and the use limitation is going to be one of those specific challenges.
And the other thing, if I could just add one thing, the other thing that's interesting is the more information that's collected by these companies, and the more it's it's aggregated, and they can start figuring out exactly who you are, where you live, etc. Some individuals feel very strongly about their privacy, and some individuals think they have more rights under the law than they do, and so it's complicating what companies are doing, because they might have the legal right to do it, and they might pass muster with the FTC, but then they're subject to litigation because people think that they should have more rights than they do under the law. So that's complicating the whole area.
Thanks, guys. So I do want to get into the legal framework, the regulatory framework around this. Just real quick, though, if we go back to the analytics portion, John. So this is an extremely compelling proposition for companies, right? There's a McKinsey statistic out there. It says a retailer using big data to the fullest extent could increase its operating margin by more than 60% if they're actually relying on that. And so that kind of begs the question, are we now in danger of over-relying on some of this type of information and some of the correlations? Because at the end of the day, that's just what it is. It's only a correlation, but it's based on a vast volume of data. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, this goes really back to what Andrea and Lee had talked about, the potential for these false correlations where you might have a potential alignment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is cause and effect. And there's an example. There are examples out there of where you can align all sorts of potential relationships, between people that wear green ties and get into automobile accidents on Thursday. I mean, you can almost make up any correlation that you want. So one of the critical things is you will need human intervention in this big data world. You will need somebody to actually do a below the surface analysis.
Yeah, so here's another example. So you have to sort of remember, big data draws from big data, and well, where does that usually come from? The internet, right? So the internet is just sort of another form of big data, and you can look at examples of, you could say that the stock market crash, right, was a result of big data, right? We had the wrong models, we looked at the wrong things, the interest rates weren't set the right price. It's all different, it's involved in all different areas of our lives. But another example that I had been reading about was, if big data feeds off the internet and there's an error in some of that information, and the example that was cited was Google Translate. So, not to beat up on Google, I'll let somebody else do that. But if you look at Google Translate, the way that a lot of times Google Translate works is you take a Wikipedia article over here, say in English, and then you take another Wikipedia article, say in a less commonly used language, right? And you draw again the correlation between the two, and you use that as how to decipher what certain words mean. Well, if there are errors in that data, right, what winds up happening is it feeds back into Google Translate, right? Because Google Translate's using that, right, as the basis for sort of defining their dictionary, if you will. And so if there's an error in, say, the word to begin with, and Google Translate keeps feeding and feeding and feeding and feeding, it just keeps reinforcing the error over and over. So if you rely on big data to make decisions that you need some relatively good accuracy for, you do have the potential to just continue to reinforce an error and can sort of continue to perpetuate bad information. It's much more effective, or it's been used much more effectively, where you don't need precision, where you can, again, in advertising, right, where if you get it wrong, it's not really to anyone's huge detriment. It can be changed, it can be fixed, but where you need precision, there are a lot of flaws and a lot of problems with it.
So let me add something to that. So we'll hopefully get to talk about it, but the last 2 years of my life, I've been very involved in the FTC's recent data broker report. And as part of the data broker report, I kind of wanted to know what, data brokers and the internet knew about me. And you can actually find out what Google thinks about you just based on your search engines. You go to Google Ad Preferences, the dashboard, and you can just see what Google thinks of you. And I went to mine, and Google classified me as a male, I am not a male, ages 25 to 35, interested in motorcycles, babies, and hygiene. Now, if you know anything about me, I don't ride a motorcycle, and I've never been on a motorcycle, and have no interest in purchasing a motorcycle in the near future. I don't have any children, and I'm not planning on having children in the near future. And while I'm definitely, keep clean, and I believe in hygiene, it is not one of my number one interests. I'm not out there buying Lysol every day. So the reason I bring that up, right, is exactly for the reasons that we're discussing here, right? It's not just important to have the right analytics in place, but you need good data for that analytics. Otherwise, you might be making wrong predictions about your customers. But beyond just, if it's just being used for marketing, it's okay. Maybe I get the wrong ad and I just throw it in the garbage. But maybe the wrong person gets that information as well, finds out I'm a motorcycle enthusiast, and all of a sudden now I'm getting maybe considered as a higher risk or for insurance or any other purposes. I think that's key. We need to be thinking about the consequences not only of the data for which is obtained and the analytics, but also unanticipated uses of that data and whoever else you might be giving this data to and how they may be using that data.
Thanks. So I want to now get into some of the legal and the regulatory framework. And there's been a lot of talk about the big data revolution. And I think what you don't really hear about is the big privacy revolution to go along with that. So to say, the companies now that are using this type of information have to do so within the confines of existing legal and regulatory framework. So I just want to take a minute and sort of set some baseline. And Lynn, maybe you can talk about what John mentioned before, the fair information practice principles and how those reconcile with some of the trends that we've been talking about.
So the FTC came out with a really big report, and I'm just going to tell you in a synopsis. It basically says that you need to be transparent with your consumers if you are a consumer-facing company, that you're telling them what information you're getting from them, what information you shouldn't be getting from them. You should only be getting the information that you need, and you should tell them what you're doing with it. Basically, you should be transparent. You should give them an opt-out if they don't want to participate. There's a whole movement around being transparent. Did I do okay? Is that it's really big.
Are you talking about this one?
No, I'm talking about even the earlier.
No, the earlier, the SAF one. Yeah.
It's just be fair with your consumers and let them know what you're doing. Then I'm gonna flip it to Andy, because then the FTC has come out to stay up to date with technology, has come out with additional very important reports that every company needs to be aware of.
Do you want me to jump right into the privacy report?
Go for it.
Okay. So right here, show and tell. Everybody look up. Cool. That's the privacy report. It was issued in March of 2012. And it's a fascinating read. It's a little long, but I promise that you'll actually learn quite a bit. So if you have some time, maybe as you're going back home today, flying back, you want to go on the website, ftc.gov. It's freely available to everybody. All of our reports are freely available to everybody. I really encourage you to go ahead and take a look at the privacy report, which is called Protecting Consumer Privacy in an Era of Rapid Change. And why do I recommend that? Well, it has 3 key recommendations for both businesses and everyone out there, honestly. The first is that companies should be implementing privacy by design approach. And that just means that you should include privacy protections into your everyday business practices, from the beginning of the development of a new product all the way to the rollout of that product and even the maintenance of that product they are on. What does that mean? What would that look like? Well, you can provide reasonable security for consumer data, collect only the data that you need for a particular business purpose. And I know in a previous panel folks were emphasizing that, but we really want to zero in on that. Collect only what you need. Retain it for only as long as absolutely necessary, and then safely, and I can't emphasize that, safely dispose of that data once you no longer need it for that particular business purpose. And then, in light of what we've been talking about, we also say you should implement reasonable procedures to promote data accuracy. Why? For the many reasons that we've been discussing earlier. So that's number 1, privacy by design. Number 2, we're urging companies to provide simpler and more streamlined choices to consumers about your data practices. So and this is in particular, for example, if it's out of context with your relationship with the consumer, right? If somebody goes to a CVS, right, and it's giving their pharmacist some information, and then CVS, not that they're doing this, but I'm giving this as a hypothetical, turns around and uses that information to pass it on to, car dealers because they found a correlation between people who go to CVS. That's not maybe something that's particularly anticipated by the customer. Right? So you need to be giving informed and meaningful choices at a relevant time and context, not buried in a privacy policy that someone will look maybe, much, much later on, but at the time that the collection is happening and in a uniform, comprehensive way. So that's number 2. Number 3, the privacy report recommends that companies take steps to make their data practices more transparent to consumers. What do we mean by that? Well, privacy policies that are more streamlined, concise, really readable, not just 20 pages of text and hidden in there. Oh, we may share it to third parties, however we want and whenever we want. Really make it clear. If you're sharing with third parties, let consumers know. And then that also means giving consumers reasonable access to the data they're collecting. Particularly if you're not a consumer-facing entity, you need to make that available so that when consumers find out that you're collecting the information, they know exactly how you're collecting it, when you're collecting it, and how you're using that data. So those are kind of the 3 main things that the privacy report espouses, but I do recommend that everybody go ahead and read it because there's a lot more information in there.
So
I was just maybe going to add a little bit more regulatory gloss. It might be at a policy level, and I think we're very lucky to have a representative from the FTC here to really be accessible and explain the report. Also just wanted to mention a policy layer to it, which is, again, going back to the White House report, it mentions one of the areas that the administration is looking at in the risks of big data is the potential for discrimination. So that is something to be aware of at a policy level. And to step even further out, if you look over at the European Union, they have a very, very strong bias, I think, toward potential uses of big data. They actually approach it, and it's talked about in different terms over there as profiling. And it's one of the things that they have in their data protection directive is a lot of limitations around what they call profiling, and it was also quite a big issue for their recent debate over their data protection regulation. And although it didn't make it through this time, the new parliament will be taking up those concerns once again.
Thanks, John. So, Andy, I just wanted to go back to you on the guidance and the report. So it's been out now for a little while, and you may have had the opportunity to see some companies or some cases coming in. So can you give everyone a sense of where companies seem to be falling short within the 3 key areas that you mentioned before? Yeah,
absolutely. And it's not just focused on the 3 tiers. So to give you guys a little bit of a way of background, the FTC is a civil law enforcement agency, and we primarily focus, at least in the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection, on Section 5 of the FTC Act, which prohibits unfair and deceptive practices. What does that mean? Well, really generally, deceptive practices is if you as a company make a material misrepresentation or omission. So that's key, right? If you're saying something that you're doing that you're not, or you're saying you're not doing something and in fact you are, then you can fall within the guise of Section 5 of the FTC Act. In terms of unfairness, there's a little bit more of a legal jargon to it, but the basic concept is this. An unfair or deceptive practice is a practice that it has causes or is likely to cause, and that's the key, likely to cause, substantial injury to consumers that's not outweighed by countervailing benefits to consumers, or that is not reasonably avoidable by consumers. So what does that mean? In the context of privacy and data security, it could mean something as simple as you offer a service, like say you are a restaurant, and obviously to pay, people need to use their credit cards. And you do nothing to secure the information of that credit card, and you just make it readily accessible to anybody to grab it. Well, that's not really, avoidable by consumers, and it's not something that really creates a benefit for society to readily have that information, and obviously can lead to substantial harm to consumers if that information is later on to harm them economically, right? So that's kind of the work that we do. What have we seen within the privacy sphere in terms of companies making mistakes, both within the Section 5 area, as well as the privacy principles that we've had? Okay, well, I have my number 4 list. I love lists. I'm sorry, guys. So to make it easy to take it home, these are like my top 4. All right. We have found companies collecting information when they didn't get consumers' consent, right? And that's, we've kind of discussed this a little bit. So the key examples, so you can go to our website, ftc.gov. You can see all the different consents that we've entered with companies. And the 3 that I would tell you to look at for this particular issue would be Path, You Promise, and Compete. But just to give you a flavor of what this looks like, Path is a social networking app, and they had a feature there that said add friends to your network. And you would go through the setup, right, and you would either click that or not click it. Well, apparently, even if you didn't click it, Path was still collecting all the information from your contacts, despite the fact that there was a button kind of giving consumers a choice. Well, we said that fell within Section 5 of unfair and deceptive practices. That's number 1, all right? Number 2, we found companies that have been sharing information with advertisers when they said they wouldn't. This is a big no-no. If you're making a statement saying you're not doing something and in fact you are, then you can fall within Section 5 of the FTC Act. And we made these allegations both in our case against Facebook as well as MySpace. Number 3, we have found companies or their products, and this is key, I want to emphasize this, providing privacy settings that misrepresent the control that consumers have over their information, that they don't work, or that only work for a limited time period. And I'll give you as an example, we recently brought a case against TrendNet, which is a networks products manufacturer, but specifically they also sell IP cameras, which are these cameras that you set up at home, you put them on, you focus them maybe on your dog or your child, and then you go to work and you can go online to a specific web address, put in a login and password, and look at the feed. Well, they had a feature on it that said, oh, you have to be able to see my feed, put in a login and password. And then you would click that and make sure that, in fact, it would be required to have a login and password. Well, it ended up being that actually the feature didn't work, and you could just go straight to seeing the feed without actually ever putting in a login and password. That came under Section 5 of the FTC Act. And a lot of these claims, they can be on a setup screen, or they can be on packaging, or they can be on your user manuals. This is key. It's not just your privacy policy or your terms and conditions. We're looking at all statements that you're making to consumers. And most consumers, honestly, are looking at packaging, user manuals. They're looking at things that are relevant to the products and how they interact with your company. All right, so that was number 2. Number 3, nope, that was 3. I'm losing count. 4, we have found companies that have made retroactive changes to previously collected information. So the key example here is our case against Facebook. As you might remember, in 2009, Facebook made some changes to their settings so that information that you thought was protected and not available freely all of a sudden became freely available. And they didn't get consumers' consent, nor did they notify them before making this change. This fell within Section 5 of the FTC Act. So these are kind of the top 4 issues that we have found that companies are making mistakes, and that then brings them, unfortunately, under our jurisdiction.
So just, Lynn, from your perspective, I mean, we talk about all this framework that's in place. And if I'm a company and I collect all that information, as long as I'm transparent, and I'm telling my customers what I'm collecting, what I'm doing with it, and who I'm sharing it with, then generally speaking, we think we're okay. What if I then want to start supplementing that information by maybe purchasing some information from data brokers or data aggregators and other outside sources? In that context, I mean, is consent and disclosure even realistic at this point?
So it's very complicated because I'm going to say to your first part of that question, if you get the consent, you're good to go. You're not good to go because there's lots of laws that apply, and also the issue of retroactively changing. So what's interesting out there right now are companies they're telling the consumers what they're doing with their data, and then they figure out a really great way to use the data or to sell it to somebody else, and then what do you do? And so you have to be really, really careful, and you have to be careful if you have a mobile app, and you have to be careful if you have a website, you have to be careful if you have geolocation. And so there's all these new technologies that there's all sorts of laws that apply, and it's very hard in many instances to comply, and then ultimately you could be subject to a class action suit because you did something with the data, or you did something that you were allowed to do, but people think that you shouldn't, and plaintiffs' attorneys think that you shouldn't have done it. So one of the classic stories is, not to pick on Google again, but Google, do you remember Google Maps, right? And when Google was developing Google Maps, they had vans that were going down streets, and if people sitting on their couches didn't have a password and didn't secure their email, and they're sitting on their couches and they're emailing their boyfriend, the Google van was able to scoop all that information. Now, Google settled with 37 different attorneys general over that, and did you guys settle with them over that one? I don't remember. You settled with them too. And that's just one way that, you know, an engineer thought that was a great idea to do that at Google, but wasn't thinking about the consequences. And a lot of times the technology and the uses of the data can get ahead of you. You get a little ahead of your skis there. And then you run into problems.
Yeah, and just, another thing, again, going back to discrimination and privacy, when you're looking at these data sets, you may collect information and it might be anonymous, but when you buy a second data set and a third data set and you overlay them, that's when you start to get issues where it's not anonymous. You know exactly who it is, and you have a ton of information on them. And then you start to, you sort of look, okay, how could that impact us going forward? And you look at discrimination, and so I apply for something and somebody has all this information on me, and maybe they're making what they feel is a good decision, but that then starts to speak to that, the legality of that, I think can be pretty clear. So, again, talking about multiple sets of data and some issues that you have with the collection of it, it's not always just, your company might be doing the right thing and you think that you're sort of on a clear path and everything's anonymous and you've got this sort of all, under wraps. But again, once you start looking at more and more sets of data, it becomes pretty clear who's who. And that's what I think frightens people, and it certainly, that's, an area for class actions where I think insurance companies, probably should pay a little more attention.
So just going back to, something that you said earlier, which was, and I think a story we were talking about before coming up, but a company that finds itself with now a vast amount of data that has been collected, and they want to start using it for something other than what they originally intended to in the first place. So if I'm a company and I want to get into something like that, what can I do to my customers to protect myself, that from class action suits coming in down the road?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that you can protect yourself from class action lawsuits at this point. It's unfortunate. There's all sorts of laws that apply, and on the train down here, I made a quick list, and basically you've got Section 5 of the FTC Act, which you really should be careful about because the FTC is definitely flexing their muscles in this area, and they have a very broad jurisdiction. CAN spam, California Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, state consumer protection laws, the TC Telephone Consumer Protection Act, self-regulatory rules and FTC best practices for digital advertising, the Office for Civil Rights, class action litigation, and we'll talk about in a second, Video Privacy Protection Act, facial recognition statutes, the California Shine the Light Act, Electronic Communications Privacy Act. So there's more, but I'm not going to take up any more time. So how does a company, how do you comply with all these laws? So it's very difficult. I think that the main theme that I'll keep going to and that I keep going to with our clients is you need to always be transparent And you need to be careful about how, you need to say up front how you're going to use the data. Your business people need to be involved with your legal team on how you're going to use the data and how you can make sure that consumers know how you're going to use the data. But I'll just tell you, when I asked how many people read Google's when they set up a Gmail account, no offense, Andy, but people aren't reading them. People aren't reading them. They want the app, they download it, they say, click, I agree. And they're not reading. And then all of a sudden they're saying, oh, I didn't know you were going to use my data like that. And that's where the class actions come into play. And then we've got courts that are all over the place with, do you need actual injury or don't you need actual injury? So I wish I had a silver bullet to say, this is what you should do. And I'll come back to the bottom line is be transparent and try to think of all the uses ahead of time and make sure you're telling consumers whether they read it or not, that's not your issue, but try to make it easy for them, try to do it in a simple and concise way, and follow CalAPA because they seem to be the farthest ahead when it comes to transparency with mobile apps, et cetera.
And if I were to just add on to that, I think Lynn is absolutely spot on. I would double down on what she said about the transparency. I think if organizations are interested in the benefits of big data, there's probably two other things I would add to the transparency element, which I would put at the top of the list. The other two I would call accountability, and the last one would be mitigation. And what I mean by accountability is it's really a concept that your organization's leadership is absolutely committed to privacy, that you designate people in your organization that are responsible for managing it and accounting for it and setting up policies and then doing training and implementing those policies. And then if something goes wrong, that you have people designated to do the mitigation, that people that will be able to come in and find out what happened and fix it. And in terms of mitigation, I mean, that it just sort of segues into mitigation, that you have mechanisms available for consumers, for individuals to come to your organization in an easy, user-friendly way to seek some sort of mitigation regarding their information if there has been an incident or a mistake. So I would just add those two elements.
Thanks, John. So Lynn, just bring it back to you. What's some of the focus of current litigation that we're seeing in this area?
So the current class action litigation, so they're all right now trying to use state law claims because all the states have different laws, but there aren't a lot of laws in states surrounding collection of consumer data. The states are we were talking about that earlier, the states are a little farther behind. What we're seeing is creative uses of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, the Stored Communications Act, the Federal Wiretap Act, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And, again, it's interesting because these laws might not be spot on because they were implemented so long ago and might not be, like the Video Privacy Protection Act clearly needs to be changed because it has no application. It was like for VCR tapes, right? It doesn't have application to what we're all doing today. But the theme is, hey, you're using my data in a way that you shouldn't be using my data. You're using my data in a way that you didn't tell me you were using my data. And a lot of times these cases are getting settled because they don't want to challenge either the state law to make bad precedent or all the litigation costs and expenses. But they're using old laws and trying to use it for class action litigation now.
Thanks, Lynn. So, Lee, I want to just round this out with maybe a little bit of a discussion on the insurance elements and then take some questions from the audience. But As underwriters, I mean, for me, in the context of offering cyber coverage, the privacy element is probably the more intimidating piece, because you're talking about these FTC regulations and the guidance, and then all the class action litigation, and then the vast troves of data that are now available to companies to use. And the questions that we ask and the information that we get from these companies as far as whether they are in compliance with all applicable regulations is a yes or a no. And we're often relying too on the fact that the company is even aware of all the applicable laws and regulations and guidance that's out there. So as an underwriter, what are your thoughts and what's your perspective on underwriting to this type of a cover?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that when we're looking at the coverage that we're offering, we look at the area of practice. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't look at this when it comes to a retailer, but if you talk to a retailer, this probably isn't on the top of their list when it comes to privacy. They're more concerned about the true breach of information. They're more concerned about POS and credit cards. I think I just saw somebody nod off. And I think that what we look at, the classes of business that we tend to look at when it comes to this are those data brokers, the people who aggregate the data in a large way. Something else that we look at is, if you look at their privacy policy and something is egregious, you might take a look and say, okay, the FTC is going to be all over that, because if you're saying this is foolproof or 100%, or you're not including something in your privacy policy that should be included, that will probably catch up with you. But something that we have to consider is privacy is a very, very big space, and depending on what area of business you're in, you may face a larger risk in a different area. So I don't think the insurance companies do a great job at looking at this particular issue with regards to every application that comes in the door. But I would say when if Axiom was to buy insurance, we would be all over them, and I think they are all over this issue. And this would be sort of the forefront of the conversation that we would have. In terms of how do we underwrite to it, I think it's nothing that's really built into the application all the time. It's more reading the privacy policies, understanding the culture of the company, knowing what the FTC is asking and what direction this issue is going in. But that's not a fantastic. Do you have a better answer actually than I do?
No, I was just going to summarize your response, saying you really have to take a holistic view, right, of the company. It's not relying on a checkbox approach, and you have to look at the industry, you look at everything on the whole, and you really have to dive into it. The downside is that we don't always have the luxury of taking that amount of time that you'd probably need to dive into those details.
Yeah, so. And I would say, though, too, in just looking at some of the big data brokers out there, they're not unsavvy when it comes to this. I mean, I think that they've taken some proactive steps and certainly have a vested interest in Washington and are trying to move issues, in their direction. But they also understand that they have a reasonable, there's a reasonable standard by which people expect them to safeguard and use the information. And, I think I do think the FTC is probably what we look at the most in terms of how are the data broker, where are they going, how are they moving, and what's kind of coming down in the next few years.
Thanks, Lee. So I know we're running out of time here, and I do want to open up the floor for some questions. Just before that, though, one final question, more of a philosophical question for all the panelists. In the new environment that we're in, our data is out there. It's being collected. It's being used in all different ways. Do we now, as individuals, need to change our basic expectations of privacy, considering all the different ways that this data is being used on a personal level? So, John, let me throw that to you.
I'll give you my philosophical and historical answer, which is this. The best analogy I can make is the invention of the printing press. After that happened, really people had to develop new skills of literacy. They had to learn how to read and write, and that just took time. It was not an overnight thing. With the digital world that has been created for us, it is going to take time for individuals and consumers, I think, to develop what I would call digital literacy, to learn how to protect their privacy and behave in a way that protects them on the internet, and it will take time. So that would be my philosophical answer. And for organizations, I think the future is that they're going to have to look at some new skill sets to manage data in a responsible way in their organizations. They're going to have to look at new things like bringing in technical experts that have mathematical expertise, for example, to manage the algorithms that work and do it in a privacy-sensitive way. And maybe even something like the medical profession has. They have medical ethicists. Could you have a data ethicist where just because you can do something with the data that might be legal, do you want to do it? And somebody to ask those questions in the organization that might keep it out of trouble. So I will pass the baton over to Lee.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the expectation of privacy going forward, I think, there's a higher expectation of people, I think, that are probably in this room than of, sort of younger generations kind of coming up the ladder. I would say that we probably have it's probably on us to develop the right framework by which we talk about big data going forward, because my concern would be that if things move too much in one direction, so people start saying, I really don't care about my privacy, right? As sort of the younger generation sort of moves into the workforce and starts making more of these decisions, they say, I don't care about my privacy, right? I think that companies will exploit that, and I think that you will see a lot of discrimination, and the concern would be then it's too late to dial back time, right? You didn't do it to start with, and now how are you going to kind of undo what's already been done? So I think things like informing people about what you do with their information, and if they want to change it or they want to opt out, allowing them the ability to do that is probably the best and the safest thing, for us on a long-term basis.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I struggled with this question when you sent it to me, because I was really thinking, is it consumers that need to change expectations, or is it the industry that needs to inform consumers better before they can actually form an expectation, right? And I think that's where I personally, not necessarily speaking for the FTC, would fall into the equation. I really think that we need to do a better job of informing consumers about data collection and use, right? And we didn't get to talk about them, but the FTC recently released a report in May of 2014 on the practices of data brokers, and that's also available on our website. And that's particularly important because not only does it find several findings that I think you, as not, your legal hat, but you as a consumer will find surprising. And I think instead of asking you as the consumer to change your expectations, you'll probably be asking some of the same things that we ask in the report, which is that the industry create a centralized portal where data brokers actually inform consumers about their data collection, use, and practices. And then have consumer-facing entities provide better notice and choice mechanisms, so that if you, as a consumer-facing entity, such as a retailer, are collecting information, you let consumers either opt in to that sort of thing if it's more sensitive information, or opt out if it's less sensitive information. But I think until we make changes to the industry, I don't think we can ask consumers to change their expectations.
Mm-hmm. Lynn?
So I was asked by a company to give them an opinion regarding whether or not they could allow their employees to wear wearable devices to work, and if they could require that they have a GPS device on their phone when they were working. And so one of my partners emailed me and said, privacy is dead. And my heart went, no, it's not. But, my attitude is, I don't want privacy to be dead. I don't, for myself and for everybody else. I don't think anyone wants privacy to be dead. I want control over my data, and I don't know where all my data is. So very much on what Andy was saying, I think from a company perspective, you need to decide, what data do we need? Do we really need it? What are we going to do with it? And are we going to be fair to our consumers? So my attitude about it is privacy is not dead, and I'm going to just keep fighting for privacy. But I think that instead of changing our attitudes about it, I think we need to have more control over what we can do. And what's frustrating to me personally, with my personal hat on, is you want to download an app, and and you can't download it unless you put location-based services on. And I don't keep location-based services on. So I think there has to be a fairness approach too, that if I want to download your app, you don't always get to know where I am all the time. So I think there's a dance that has to continue to go on until we get to that conclusion.
I'm going to be fighting with you, Lynn.
All right, good.
I'm a little creeped out that Amazon's beginning to know me better than my wife.
I know.
Guys, we're out of time. I want to thank the panelists very much. So, thanks. Want to take any questions from the audience?
Yes, there must be. There's
Everyone
One
wants to go
in the
home.
back.
Thank you so much. Lynn and Andrea, you talked about terms of use, and I think you talked about it once again in sort of the closing comments, Lynn, as well. And I guess I know that there have been some work on just making it more plain speak, but there are pages and pages and pages. And I clicked through and I just hit accept. Is there some sort of a move or a desire of the FTC to maybe drive, making it a shorter form or just making it more plain speak? I know there are motivations as to why they want it to be so long because, they can jam a whole bunch of stuff in there and then they can use your information however they want and you've accepted. But it's almost unfair. I mean, you just want to use an app for one thing and you have to go through like 30 pages in very small type in order to get to that app.
So in terms of your question, right, the privacy report does talk about privacy policies, but it also talks generally about the kind of notices that you're giving to consumers. And there is a recommendation there for businesses to have more streamlined, right, and more simplified choices. So certainly the FTC has recommended to businesses and requested that businesses adopt that. Beyond that, I can't say more.
So I'll just say the California Attorney General is ahead of the curve on this in this space, and she has issued very good guidance for privacy policies, particularly with mobile apps. And there's a two consent process where you'll have a very short, and we recommend this for mobile apps now, that it's a very short privacy policy that can fit the screen, that basically tells you what their practices are, and then there's a click to the longer, and hopefully it's not 30 pages because that's old school, and it's a double consent. So I would highly recommend that you download this guidance from the California Attorney General. It's quite good.
And if you're looking for mobile apps specifically, the FTC did recently release also a report on mobile apps, and it has a lot of recommendations on what kind of approaches you should be taking when developing your mobile apps, including what the terms of use and disclosures.
Thanks, guys. Do we have one more question here? Okay. Additional questions? Thanks for your time, everyone.
Thank you.